Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot
Okay.
Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today I'm joined by one of the most talented, inspirational, and caring polyglots in the world. Richard Simcoe, welcome to the show. How are you feeling today, my friend?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I know you must have done many interviews by now where people ask you kind of similar questions time and again, like how many languages do you speak? How did you become interested in learning languages, etc. But I hope that today we're seeing a slightly different dimension to it because the Hyperpolyglot Activist is a public outreach initiative that seeks to, yes, teach languages and teach how to learn languages, but also make people aware of the broader socio-political picture that surrounds learning languages and how that it shapes and is shaped by the language learning journey, whether it is by explicating linguistic ideologies such as monolingualism or native speakerism, accentism, etc., or by discussing emancipatory alternatives such as language activism, allyship, and inclusivity. So with that being said, my first question would be, what do you think about the question itself? How many languages do you speak? Do you see it as a useful way of getting to know
Uh,
your polyglot identity in a few seconds, or do you see it as a symptom of the way society shapes and thinks about quantity? What are your thoughts on that?
the question itself, I think most of the time is actually quite an innocent one, and it's a natural question that people would ask. So I don't shy away from it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I try and give an honest best I can.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like sort of anyone who really gets into any field of study or any field of sort of interests or sports or whatever else, the most basic questions tend to be the ones that become hardest to answer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and when it comes to languages, um, you know, for most people saying something like, well, I speak 5 languages, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and those languages are English, German, French, Italian, I don't know, Mandarin, whatever you want to choose. It seems pretty obvious that they are separate languages. They're very easy to distinguish
Mm-hmm.
between each other. You can say this is French. That's a language. You speak that, so that's one, and then you just add them up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the issue for people who learn multiple languages, particularly language families, is that very often you'll study pretty much all of the languages in a family, which could total in excess of 10 languages just for one family.
Right.
Now, my main focus in life has been 3 language families, which are the Germanic languages, which obviously English is a part, as well as German, Scandinavian languages, Dutch, Afrikaans, you name it. And then I've got the Romance languages, which I've also done, studied at university and lived in a number of countries where they speak those languages, like French and Spanish and Portuguese and Catalan and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Slavic languages, of which one is my home language, Macedonian, and I studied Czech, and I studied Russian and Polish and Serbian and Croatian and Bulgarian, and the list goes on and on. It kind of, and if you just added all those languages up, and when you sort of mention that to people, they're sort of there counting in their heads, sort of, oh, wait a minute, just a minute. Well, you said that language and you said that language, and they're counting them all up, and then they'll say, well, how do you say a word or something in that language, or say it in all these languages?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, sometimes when you study a language in the same family, the same group, like if I were to say the word dog in English, okay, that word is quite easy to sort of guess or to know in many of the other languages in the family. For example, Hund in German comes from the word, and also is the same root as the word hound in English. And then you've got in the Romance family, the word for dog actually changes quite a lot. It goes from perro in Spanish to cachorro in Portuguese to gos in Catalan, and a word like that is very, very different in each independent language. And when you study language families, you're not necessarily studying them all for the same reason. Sometimes you're studying them because you want to understand what the differences are in the grammar, what the differences are generally in the vocabulary. You don't necessarily need to memorize all of the same stuff that you're learning when you first learn a new language. You're doing it with a very different goal in mind. So it can be a very strange scenario where you understand the news, you understand, you can read a newspaper, particularly on things to do with the economy, the environment, politics. They're very, very easy to understand once you speak one of those languages really well. Right. They're the easy topics, and they're usually the hard topics, right? The difficult topics are if you go into a kitchen and somebody tells you which ingredients to take and how to make something, like to bake a cake or to do something like that, which, strangely, if you were to go to a class as a beginner, would be some of the first things you'd learn at sort of the A1, end of A1, A2 level. You would start learning how to sort of mix things in a bowl and take the ingredients and how many grams and whatever else. That would be a harder thing to understand as somebody who's come from this position of polyglot or hyper polyglot that wants to just explore the language family. And this is where it becomes difficult to then start talking about levels and to start talking about how well you speak a language and how many languages you actually speak and in which sort of situation. This is where you see a lot of debate as well in the online language learning community, where people say, I bet they can't say this, and I bet they don't know the word for shoelaces, and I bet they don't know the word for this word and that word and the other word. And you think, well, okay, but do you really need to know all of that? And is it really necessary to know all of that to understand how the language works and to communicate your ideas? You can always ask for those questions, right? You can always ask and look things up. It's not like we're all connected to our mobile phones now. We're all sort of on the internet. And if you need a specific word, you can always check. But the question then becomes, do you then dedicate your life to one language or two languages that you will know inside out, backwards and forwards, and you'll know every single word to the degree that even some monolingual native speakers would not know? Or are you interested generally in the language family, and then the language families that are in influence, the larger sort of, as you zoom out and you see how languages interconnect across language families, whether that's for geopolitical reasons, whether just proximity, like a language like Hungarian, for example, that's not an Indo-European language, but has adapted itself to some of its neighboring languages and taken on words into the Hungarian language, or from the Ottoman Empire through Turkish. What the influences are actually quite varied and quite different. And as you learn more and more languages, you start to see these connections in a very different way. And I think this is where, for a polyglot or a hyper polyglot, it becomes extremely difficult to then say, I speak this number of languages. And so in turn, what I then now say is I've studied over 50 languages, because that's what I've done. I've studied over 50 languages. And I don't even know, it could be more than 60 now. It could be, I don't know, but 50 feels like a nice number to say, to make it sound like, yeah, it's been quite a lot. And it's not just those three language groups anymore. I mean, I've studied other groups as well outside of the Indo-European families, and also other Indo-European languages.
I saw that one of the things that caught my eye at the beginning, when I wasn't even part yet of the polyglot community, is the fact that, as you said, instead of saying, oh, I speak X number of languages, you say, well, I've studied X number of languages. And then in the polyglot conference, which you organize, at least in one of the editions, the slogan was, for everyone who loves languages. And that plays into the same narrative again. It's not so much about competence or skills, it's about interest or passion. Do you think that that's the defining aspect of the polyglot community, even more so than the number of languages that people speak?
In fact, I'm going to make a slight correction to what you said, because we don't say languages, what we say is for everyone who loves language, and that's also deliberate. And the reason I do that is because I've met people who speak one language, but they're so into language and their own language and where it's borrowed from and how it's developed, and particularly a polyglot language like English, because obviously the word polyglot means somebody who speaks lots of language, but also in English it can be used to mean a language that's taken in from many languages as well. So a language itself can be a polyglot in a similar way. And so for me, I feel that I can learn probably just as much sometimes from a monolingual who has studied their own language in such depth that they could sit and talk to me forever and teach me things every single day.
Right.
And so I recognize the beauty and in that diversity within the language community, where people bring really specific knowledge. And to go back to your question, whether that's sort of something deliberately, yes, it is. And I think that it's really important that we sort of make sure everyone feels welcome, that everyone has something to add to the dialogue. Did that answer your question? I feel like I missed the second part of your question there. So if I did, let me know.
No, you did answer my question. My question was whether for everyone who loves language, and I appreciate that nuance because I hadn't thought about it that way. And one of my question was, how do you square the circle between creating a community such as the polyglot community and make it as inclusive as possible? Because every insight presupposes an outside. So if you create a community, even though its initial intention can be as horizontal as it gets, you're always going to leave someone behind, right? But then I hadn't thought about this extra layer of inclusivity, which is everyone who loves language. So even if you are a monolingual person, you're still part of the polyglot community. So I found that very, very interesting. But my second question was, does that mean that the polyglot community is first and foremost defined by passion and an interest rather than a skill in that particular language?
Yeah, I think that the really passion is the thing. That's the key thing. Skill and passion, trying to decide where one starts and the other begins, where one ends and the other begins, is difficult, because what I tend to find is I'm always attracted to people who are passionate. So I love being in conversation with people who are passionate, and it doesn't matter what they're talking about. They could be talking about things I am genuinely or generally not interested in. So I've got a friend actually who he will get into all sorts of different things that are not my world. And one time he got into marathon running, and he spoke to me for 2 hours about marathon running. Now, I am probably the most least interested person in marathon running that you'll be able to find. But I love it when other people are enthusiastic and passionate about something. So he managed to keep my attention talking on this topic for like 2 hours. And it's incredible when people amass a wealth of knowledge because of their passion, because it drives them to consider different things, to think about different things, to explore what's going on. And this is the key, really. I mean, people ask about what the secret to language learning is, and learning multiple languages and learning a language well and getting beyond these different levels that they talk about. Actually, the only real secret is being passionate and making it part of your life, because if you're passionate, you will make it part of your life. Right. So that is the one thing. And it's passion with an inquisitive nature. So I remember walking around cities with friends many occasions, and I will fixate on signs that I see, on words that I hear, and I'll quiz speakers of the language just to ask them, okay, well, does that come from this, and how is that related to other things? And I'm always trying to find this relationship. And people have said to me in the past many times, wow, you really do think about language all the time. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of how I do it, because
I totally agree with your point.
It's constantly there.
I totally agree with your point that willpower and going through the motions can only take you so far in life. not only just in language learning, but in general, right? You need that extra passion, that drive, that motivates you. And I wonder whether that's what distinguishes in its connotation the term polyglot from the term multilingual, because in theory, as to their denotation, they both mean the same thing, right? Someone who speaks many more than one language, whether it comes from a Latin root as in multilingual or from a Greek root as in polyglot. But through your organizing the Polyglot Conference and further events and people you have inspired, you've really come to redefine this term in the online language learning community. People don't speak about the multilingual community, they speak about the polyglot community, right? So do you think that what distinguishes the multilingual from the polyglot is that the polyglot has an investment in learning languages that goes beyond a materialistic element or a profession, that goes beyond a way of life?
It's an interesting idea, this thing of two words that basically really do mean the same thing, if you go to the roots, right, as you rightly said. And had you asked me this question before the advent of the whole internet communities of online language learners and then the sort of subsection of the polyglot community, I would have agreed and said, yeah, it's the same thing. The meaning for me personally has developed beyond that. And whenever I speak to people as well within the community, I often see a nod of the head when I say this. For me, a multilingual, especially when I'm talking about the English language, okay, because in other languages, the term polyglot is more well known. Like in French, polyglot is something that people know as a term. Just generally, anyone on the street would know the word polyglot, whereas in English, people don't know the word polyglot as readily and as it's just not as commonly used as a term. Multilingual is. And I think this is why in English particularly, the word multilingual is used for somebody who has just ended up speaking many different languages, multiple languages. And they didn't necessarily choose the languages that they speak, they just speak them. So let me give an example of somebody who was born in, say, Luxembourg, would grow up speaking Luxembourgish, French, German, and then at school they would have English probably, and maybe another foreign language, and then they may be from the Portuguese minority community there, or they may be from the Serbian community and they speak Serbian and Portuguese at home as well. So then they speak 5-6 languages before they even start with foreign languages. They didn't choose to speak all of these languages. That just happened as a process of being born, growing up, and going through the school system. They speak 5 or 6 languages. So for me, those people are multilingual. Are they polyglots? If they want to identify as being polyglots, yes.
Right.
But if they don't think about languages, exactly. But if they don't think about languages and their career is in accountancy, finance, would they then say that they're polyglots? Possibly not. They'd probably just say, well, I speak different languages.
Right.
And so multilingual fits. Polyglot potentially doesn't. And this is where I think a polyglot is somebody who has chosen to learn languages that they don't ordinarily need to know for their existence. And this is for me where the term polyglot kind of is, you've gone out of your way to learn languages.
Right. Again, it's not non-utilitarian. It plays again into that passion, into that drive, conscious. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And what about the term hyperpolyglot? I've noticed you've used polyglot or hyperpolyglot at some point in this interview, and the term hyperpolyglot is even more new than polyglot, right?
Yeah.
So becoming mainstream. There have been pieces now in the New York Times published about this. There's the Hyperpolyglot Association. There's a hyperpolyglot activist, right? And here, the way I use hyperpolyglot is a bit tongue-in-cheek, because I'm aware of the fact that it can be interpreted as a neoliberal newspeak, as a narcissistic form of self-definition. Yeah. But at the same time, I do see a usefulness for the purpose of categorization, right? It's not the same speaking 4 languages and speaking, say, 20. So where do you stand there?
For me, it really makes no difference which term people use. I'm not really so bothered. Like you say, I mean, the term hyperpolyglot is a term that was term that was coined and used and exists. So it's there. It has a definition, which is, again, could be useful. How you measure it is difficult because, as I was saying before, if you speak to somebody who's studied Spanish and Italian and then they go and French and then they go and learn Catalan, well, they might be able to get away with saying an awful lot in Catalan very, very well and quite accurately. But then ask them what the word for, for the word for yellow is, the word for dog is, the word for red is, and all of a sudden those words are completely different in Catalan. So it becomes difficult to know where you test and how you test people to make those kinds of definitions as to, okay, well, if you don't know that word, then, because I mean, most people who are listening to this would probably say, if you don't know the word for yellow or dog or red, you probably don't know the language very well. But that doesn't actually follow, as I'm sure you've experienced as well. You can know a language pretty well and still miss some very basic words when you're doing a general study of a language. It just means that you haven't come across them yet. I mean, you can learn those words in a day, right? And then, okay, now do you know the language just because you learned those 3 words? But it becomes very difficult to quantify what it means to be a hyper polyglot as opposed to a polyglot or a multilingual or whatever other definition you want to attribute to it. Now, I only used it in this context because obviously you used the term yourself. People do know the term who are probably listening to this and are sort of interested as well in the idea of whether there's a difference. Officially, yes, there's a difference. For me personally, no. If you called me monolingual, I wouldn't really be bothered either, because to a degree, I am monolingual in that I grew up as a monolingual. I didn't grow up as a multilingual child. I didn't grow up as a polyglot, and so I am still a monolingual. I am also, to a degree, everything in between. So, and I'm not offended by any of the terms, and I don't really I don't really put too much weight on terminology like that. I think it's more important that the people who need to use your skills and expertise are happy that you can do what you say you can do, or that they need you to do for their clients or for whatever purposes you're employed or whatever you're doing.
And before we move into the activist part, I wanted to ask a last question on the polyglot part of it, which is fluency versus erudition. It seems to me that as we speak about what it means to be a polyglot, you seem to adopt a definition that has to do with fluency more so than with erudition or things that you can see in an encyclopedia or on your smartphone, etc. When it comes to learning a language and being able to speak a language, what really matters is fluency, whether you're able to express yourself on a wide range of topics, even though you don't necessarily know the intricacies and the exact word for certain terms. But I've noticed that fluency, while it's very important in the English language and the Anglo-Saxon world in general, I don't see that term has the same currency in, say, Romance languages, for instance, right? For instance, in Spanish, which is my first language, we very seldom will ask, ¿tienes fluidez en inglés, right? Whereas the question, are you fluent in English, will be very much a recurring question in the English language. What do you think about that interlanguage difference?
Yeah, there is that sort of thing when it gets to Spanish, and I think also Italian as well has that, where you don't sort of talk about it in the same way as in English. French, I think you do more. Couramment, you would say in French more than you would in, say, corrientemente in Spanish. It would not really. Yeah, it's sort of this idea of flowing, and I think when we take the word fluency and actually look at sort of what that really means, and it's this idea of a flow, right? Like a river flowing, and the water just flows through. And the French word's quite nice for that, and the Spanish word corrientemente, corriente, like this idea of a flow of the words flowing. And in English, the word fluency is often used as well for communities where people have speech issues, where they're not able to produce their own monolingual mother tongue, these speakers that have maybe a stutter, stammer, or other issue impeding their fluency of speech. And it's used in that context too, in English a lot. So some people, when you talk about language fluency, they think about that first as well. So I think that what we are really talking about is, does the language flow out of you naturally? Whether it's your first language or another language. And if that's with a few rocks in the river, the sort of, the mistakes that you make, whether it's got rocks in the river or not, or whether it goes over a waterfall and something, however that flows, it flows. Okay, so
so it has to do
with
not having to make conscious effort, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it just becomes natural. I mean, one of the things that I remember reading many years ago was at the start of I think it was a preface of a Teach Yourself book. And it said, language learning is overlearning. And I think that's probably the truest sentence I've ever read about language learning. And it really is. I mean, whether it's your first language or your 31st language, you learn it to the point that it becomes an automatic response. And that's obviously how we learn our first languages, right? We just learn enough stuff that it's so automatic.
That goes into the saying, an amateur is someone who practices it until he gets it right, and an expert is someone who practices it until he cannot get it wrong, right? Because it's so ingrained, it has become second nature, right? As you said.
And this is kind of what fluency is. I mean, and then when you talk about fluency as well, I mean, depends on the topic that you're talking about. So even a monolingual native speaker may not be fluent in certain areas of communication, certain topics. They may not have the vocabulary, whether it's technical vocabulary. They may confuse words that they don't use very often, or they've never really fully understood when they've heard them on the news, or in school, or on papers, or I've come across many monolingual speakers of a number of languages where in a conversation they get terminology confused, and I'm not talking about really technical things. I'm talking about what would be part of a C1, C2 exam for a foreign language learner, a language learner to pass. And I think that sometimes on some of these exams, some monolingual speakers would struggle.
Yeah, definitely. There's research on that, and exactly. I mean, C2 level requires not only being a speaker of that language as your first language, but also being highly educated, right? So these are two different things that are being tested. And going into the activism part, what does language activism mean to you? Because I think there are at least two ways, which are not necessarily opposed, in which we can interpret language activism. One can interpret it as charity-like efforts that one makes to better a community occasionally or sporadically, and addressing the structural issues that have to do with racism or inequality or poverty. How do you see language activism and your role in making the world a better place by using languages? Okay,
so as soon as you say that kind of word activism, there are a few things that stick out to me. The first is Respond Crisis Translation, which is an organization I've been working with, and it's an organization that basically sources translations of important documents for people to be able to access resources that they need, whether it's they've got into difficulties in a different country, they don't have the right documentation, or documentation's in a language that's not accepted, and it's done on a volunteer basis, and people help using their languages to give quite tangible sort of results for people who are in need around the world and don't have the resources to be able to source an official translator. So there's that kind of activism, which I support and believe very strongly in. So with the Polyglot Conference, I like that we have that platform to create videos, to share that kind of information of how people can get involved. And I definitely see one of the things that I do is whenever there's a need for that kind of thing, I will share within my network that people are needed to help out with things like that.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that I would do that's quite a tangible, really quite a concrete outcome from what my work on in language learning and in the community. And then the second thing that's also, this is in no particular order, so it's not first or second in any way like that, but the other thing that I would say as well is indigenous, endangered, vulnerable languages for me are very important. And now, one thing that people say very often, and I've heard this quite a lot from different places, is polyglots should, could, and have a responsibility to learn at least one of these languages, because it's possibly easier for them to do. They can do it more quickly, and they can support a community and get involved in a community. Now, I agree I agree with that to the point that yes, they can, and they can help to raise the profile. Whether or not, it depends where they're based, and it depends how much time they've got and what other languages and what other things they're doing as well. There's a lot that goes into that. And so I wouldn't put the same type of pressure on people, but I would say that we can all learn some of these languages to a degree and share more information about them. And also highlight the language as existing in the first instance to many people who don't even know it exists. And I think that's good too. So I'm all for doing courses in languages that I otherwise know very little about, or languages like Ladino that I know you're passionate about. I studied it for a couple of months, went to Istanbul, met Karen there, and went to all of the presentations in the community, in the Ladino speaking community, and listened to them all in Ladino and thoroughly enjoyed it. And then on the back of that, invited her to speak at the Polyglot conference in Thessaloniki, and then obviously wanted you to speak on the same topic as well. And all of these things help, I think, to get more reach, more people out there. So these are also other things that I like to do. At the moment, I'm learning a language called Kristang. I don't know if you know Kristang.
Yes, Kristang.
So at the moment I'm learning that, I'm on this 10-week course. I'm halfway through, and it's a Portuguese, Malay, Creole, and spoken in parts of Malaysia and Singapore. And it's spoken by very few people. I think there's like 100 or so people that speak it. But it's super interesting to learn. And for me, learning these languages, particularly these vulnerable, endangered, indigenous languages, is not so much about the language itself. It's about the people behind the language more than anything else, because you hear about their stories, you hear about their identities, you hear about what's important to them, you hear about history, from a different point of view that's not in all of the books, because history is always written, as they say, by the winners, right? Or by the people that want to sort of dictate how history is written and recorded. Whereas when you learn some of these languages, you learn things from a very different point of view. And I'm very, very much into that. I have a personal investment in it as well, because obviously being ethnically English and Welsh, it's a story, the idea of indigeneity resonates with me, because obviously half of my family's original language was Welsh, and it was lost because it was seen as a disadvantage to speak it.
Right. I totally agree with you on this. I think Respond Crisis Translation is doing a great job. I'm myself part of Respond Crisis Translation for translations in Spanish, for instance. I interview Ariel Cohen for the Hyperpolyglot Activists, and definitely they're doing a terrific job. As you said, I'm also invested in Ladino when it comes to minority languages or minoritized languages. And what you said about languages and speaking communities is key to me, because sometimes we have a tendency to perceive languages as autonomous, self-contained entities, and we tend to forget that they're always already linked to they're speaking communities, and that protecting languages means at the end of the day protecting the community of its speakers, right? So I think it's great to emphasize that.
Yeah, a language is always a vehicle for a culture and a community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I see language. And I think you sort of mentioned in your question as well, the idea of having minorities or different groups of people speaking and hearing their voices. And I think just as a natural extension of those activist activities,
Mm-hmm.
it should be a nice byproduct that you hear a more diverse range of voices.
Right.
Sometimes you do have to, as an organizer, sometimes I have to reach out and sort of make sure the playing field is as level as I can make it, because clearly not everybody is in the same situation. Not everybody identifies with the same speakers or communities. So sometimes you need to reach out and actually offer in a more active way this olive branch of, you're welcome to, we want you to speak to, we need to hear more of the voices from your community as well. It's not just the same types of people that you may perceive as being on stage. It's actually, this is for everyone.
Right. That's key, because I think when you take a sort of hands-off approach and say, okay, we just, we welcome everybody, that is already taking a stance toward that is going to run counter those people who are at a disadvantage. So if you want to have a truly equal field, you have to be proactive and reach out certain people that otherwise wouldn't apply themselves of their own volition, right? And or of their own means, better to say.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And so in that sense, in academia, for instance, we often speak about the need to decolonize academia, to sort of dismantle structural inequalities and make more people from different backgrounds have the same access to academia. Do you think there is still a need to decolonize the polyglot community as well? Do you see that there is still any sort of bias towards, for instance, Anglo-Saxon white male privilege? Is that a thing that you think ought to be addressed, or you think you're just doing things in the right direction, which I think it is also true. I've seen that the Polyglot Conference makes conscious efforts to have talks that are not just in English, that are as diverse as possible in its languages and representation.
In terms of diversity of languages for presentations, we can't prescribe that everyone has to use a certain language, and it wouldn't be fair to put that pressure. People have got the freedom of expression in whichever language they choose. That said, I always, and will now in this interview say, we really welcome presentations in multiple languages, different languages, just because that diversity is important. We still get a lot of things presented in English, even when English isn't necessarily the first language of the presenter, and I believe it's really important, because to be able to hear more languages, because when people express themselves in different languages, it's a badge of the idea of a language learning community, right? That you don't just hear one language, you hear lots of languages. In terms of whether or not everybody is represented, I don't know how fair it is for me as to be able to say that I would actually welcome people's thoughts from outside on that, and where we could encourage more people. So I would actually throw that open to anybody listening to this and thinking, well, actually, you know what? I know somebody who's be really good to speak. I always kind of throw these things back to the people who raise them. And I think it's important to do that, because we can go to an organization, we can go to a person and say, well, this isn't like this isn't like that, this is the other. Okay, but what are you going to do to help create that with us? And so we can go so far. We're not a big team, so we can go so far, but we also need people to help as well. And so I always go back and say this. And I remember I was at the Polyglot conference in Fukuoka, and somebody came up to me at the end of the conference and said, the conference was great, I really enjoyed it, but just way too much English was spoken, like in between the in between all of the presentations, and even on stage there was quite a lot of English, and I said, okay, so you and I have got 10 languages in common, as I can see from your badge, and you've come to raise this with me in English. Yeah, so you're part of the problem. And
Right.
if you're not prepared to be the vehicle of change yourself too, it just adds to the problem that you're pointing out.
Yeah.
And I think it's all well and good identifying an issue. It's a step further to actually come back with something concrete. So anybody listening, in addition to, you'd like to see more of these types of people, these types of groups, also have a look and research to see if you can find people that we can reach out to and suggest names, because that is where we can actually make the change. Otherwise, it's super difficult for us as a team to go out and research and write to a gazillion people. It really helps if, as a community, we get together and do this and share the call for papers when they come out, share these kinds of, encourage people, put them in contact with me directly. I'm absolutely thrilled to know if somebody wants to talk or be involved in the conference from a particular community. I think it's great. So yes,
Awesome.
I think we're on the right road. It definitely is. It's good the way we're working, but there are definitely groups that are missing. Africa is an entire continent that is extremely underrepresented in the language learning community generally, let alone in the polyglot events or language events that we see.
Yes. Even in Ladino is underrepresented. So we have Haketia, which is the less well-known dialect of Ladino, spoken in Morocco, for instance, and there's way less research about it than it is about Udesmo or the Eastern Mediterranean variety, definitely.
Yeah.
And I wanted to finish with a little story, with a little anecdote that I think it's important apropos the power of words. In 2011, I was living in London. I was doing a master's degree in philosophy there, and that carried over to 2012. And so I volunteered for the Olympic Games to perform in the opening ceremony. And I had an epiphany there. I wasn't looking for it, but it sort of happened to me. So we were a lot of people from different walks of life in the room, in the casting. And the organizer, at a certain point, he said, well, if you notice that someone's first language is not English, reach out and try to translate or try to help them out, etc. And that was the first time I had heard that expressed with this turn of phrase, first language, as opposed to native speaker or foreign language. And that got me thinking. It stuck with me even until today. I still remember the way he said that and the effect that it had on me. And it made me feel at so much ease. It made me feel so much more included and welcome in that event. And it was a terrific success in terms of inclusion, the London 2012 opening ceremony. And I just think sometimes that the polyglot community is making so many efforts that are well-intended and successful in including communities from all over the world and making people feel included. But at the same time, it reproduces categories and labels that have been used to split people or split groups. And I'm thinking about foreign language as opposed to world language, for instance.
As opposed to what language? Sorry.
World language.
World language, yeah.
For instance, in academic departments, there's a trend now of relabeling foreign languages department as world languages department, because it's certainly more inclusive. Same with native speaker or L1 speaker, the speaker of a language as her first language, as opposed to someone who is born into the language or has a birthright to a given language. And I wanted to know your opinion on what I see as a paradox. On the one hand, this intention, and on the other hand, this vestige of remnants of categories that have a colonial origin, and even though they're no longer intended to mean the same, they still carry that semantic tradition.
Yeah, so the term native speaker of a language, people can refer to themselves as a native speaker of a language still. In the UK, actually, you cannot ask for a native speaker to fill a position, for example. It's not legal to do that in a job advert. And the reason is because we have a number of people in the United Kingdom who speak English to a native level, or to a sort of a first language speaker level, but then they would know themselves as a native speaker because they may speak a different language at home as their native tongue, because of their heritage, their family background, because they grew up in a part of the UK where another language is spoken as well, an indigenous language maybe, or whichever language it is. So that distinction in the UK has always been with me, between this idea of a native level and native speaker. And I don't have a problem with somebody saying that they're a native speaker of a language, because I think people are entitled to say that if they want to. And I don't feel personally, some people I saw on Twitter actually recently, somebody mentioned the idea of native speaker or native level speaker felt this colonial thing, and that was the first time I've ever perceived that myself. And I'm always open to sort of understanding the background of words and why someone would feel that, and why maybe we should choose an alternative. And actually, it was only last week that I really perceived this with the idea of native level, because native level to me has never been problematic until I saw this, and you mentioning it now. I think people do get a little bit obsessed with levels, of which level do you speak, and this is where I sort of go back to, when we spoke in the beginning about when you go into different language families, and these ideas of C1, C2, B1, B2, whatever, it's all very arbitrary. it's the very short thing. So I remember when I went to study in Spain, I went to study as a Spanish speaker, first language Spanish speaker. I had to pass this interview and to be assessed as a Spanish, that kind of level Spanish. And the teacher gave us, I was doing a master's program in it was called an MBE, an MBA, is the equivalent in the US, and Masters in European Business. And when I was studying, we had this thing about how well do you know Spanish? And they gave us a list of words to see if we could understand what the meanings were. And they were quite challenging words. And obviously my linguistic background, with having studied Italian and French and other languages, I actually found it very easy. Whereas my Spanish national counterparts didn't perform as well as I did in that test on their own language.
Oh, wow.
I think I got 17 out of 20, which was the highest of everyone in the class. And I came joint with one Spanish speaker, and there were about 30 of us, I think, at the time. But the rest of the Spanish speakers were getting around 14, right. 13, 14, around there. And they found it challenging, whereas I didn't, because of the other languages that I spoke. Right. So yes, I think do I think that I'm better than the Spanish speakers that were in my class in that Spanish? No, but it shows you where these boundaries don't really make much sense anymore.
Right.
And why being inclusive of a speaker of a language, are you a speaker of this language or that language, yes or no, becomes more relevant. And I think it's very strange, because I catch myself every now and again, or other people catch me, because when I talk about Macedonia, I talk about in our language. And obviously I'm not originally from the Balkans, and I didn't learn Macedonian until I was 27. Right. But it's my language too now, and even in spite of the fact that there will be people who grew up speaking, native speakers of the language, who grew up speaking the language, who will just know probably a more correct formulation of something, or I will make a mistake that they won't naturally make. In spite of that, I don't think that it's fair to sort of compare anymore. I think that it can be my language.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So I think it is. You're right. In the community, sometimes we do focus a little bit on that, a little bit too much on that. Also, we underestimate what an A1 and an A2 level actually means.
Right.
You know, people will write and say they've achieved, oh yeah, I've been studying it for 2 weeks, I'm A2. I sincerely doubt you're an A2 level because I studied Turkish to B1 level and sat the exams A1, A2, and B1, and it took me 3 months intensive study, 16 hours a week of classes and 20 hours a week outside class to reach an A1 level.
Right.
So that was intensive study, and then the same for the A2, and the B1 was double that.
Right.
So to give context, it takes of intensive study almost about 1.5 to 2 years of studying a language to get to a B1 level in a very unknown language.
Right.
So it is strange when I see these kinds of things, and how important is it really anyway, and do you really feel that confident, and what does it really mean, and is it really important? No. Only if you're applying for a job or something, or university, and you need to demonstrate that you've got a certain level of ability in a language to do it. And once you can communicate, and once you've got this fluency that we were talking about before, and you can communicate and you feel at home in the language, whether you're an L1 speaker, an L2 speaker, native speaker, near native speaker, whether you're a fluent speaker, whatever you want to describe yourself as, doesn't really matter. You're a speaker of the language.
Yes, I totally agree with you. The territory is always more complex than the maps and the categories we make for the idealizations. And and so I wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart for devoting so much time and thought and care to this interview. And before I let you go, I would like to ask you, how can people join you? What are some final words you may have? How can people become part of this language learning journey?
So as we said, the Polyglot Conference is a conference that takes place every year. We actually have an online forum and an online live environment that you can join at any time and catch up with people in the language learning community. And if you simply go to polyglotconference.com, you will find the links, and you will also find links to the social media from there too. And for me personally, I go under the name of Speaking Fluently, and I have a blog, speakingfluently.com, and from there you can find the Facebook page, Instagram account, Twitter account, and all that lovely stuff, and YouTube. And I'm always happy to sort of talk. I do lives regularly so that people can ask questions as well. So if you have a question that's important, then feel free to drop by.
Thank you so much, and I can attest to the fact that you always answer so many questions in those Q&A. You always read my question, and you take the time and the effort to go through as many questions as you can in every live session, and I think that's really useful for the community and inspirational. So thanks so much, Richard. I'll make sure to link all the resources that you mentioned in the description below the video, and it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for having me along.